Hello, Jim. It's my pleasure to be here today to discuss your new book, The Eve of Destruction, How 1965 Transformed America. As you know, we historians love to ask one another how it came to be that you decided to write about a given topic. And so what brought you to write about 1965?
Well, I taught 20th century and 19th century American history for a number of years, mostly at Brown University. And as we moved through I actually started doing this in the 60s. And so I didn't teach the 60s then because it wasn't history, but later on, of course, it became an important part of my courses. And then I've written some books which have talked about aspects of the 60s. And like a lot of other historians, I became a little bit uncomfortable with the notion that the 60s can be described as something 1960 to 1970. Historians like to do this, you know. They like to talk about the 30s or the 20s or the 90s and so forth. And sometimes it works. I think the 30s you can do that because of the power of the Depression throughout the decade. But mostly it doesn't work. And in the case of the 60s, I don't think it does either. Because if you look back at what was happening in the early 60s, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, at least until Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, so much of daily life and popular culture and music and politics and so forth, and the way people dressed and so forth, seemed very much like the 50s. And when we think of the 60s, we think of a lot of turmoil, political polarization, urban riots, Vietnam, rock concerts, Woodstock, and so forth and so on. And I became convinced that you really should not talk about the 60s as 1960 to 1970, but something where the 60s start somewhere around 1965, which is what I've done.
Now, did you realize that at the time? In other words, did you feel your world change around you in 1965?
A little bit. I mentioned in the preface to this book that I started teaching at Indiana University in September 1964. It was my first real job after getting my doctorate, and I was very busy preparing courses. And I also, my wife and I had a son in December of 1964, so I was not really paying a whole lot of attention to what was going on in the world. But it became impossible, of course, at a university campus particularly, not to be aware of the tensions and divisions which were developing. And while they were not particularly severe at Indiana University in 1965, they certainly became that way within a couple of years. And they did on other campuses, such as Michigan, which had the first teach-in in March of 1965, a Big Ten rival of Indiana. You begin to see a lot changing. The students begin to dress differently. They begin to be much more, some of them at least, much more concerned with what's going on in Vietnam.
So you saw the change take place before your eyes. But let me ask you this question. Even though you saw the change taking place, when did you start thinking of the 60s as history?
Oh, probably not till sometime in the 90s, 80s or 90s. I'm pretty sure it wasn't until the 80s, for instance, that a significant portion of my course syllabus, which was 20th century history, included significant readings on the 1960s. So maybe that's one answer to your question. But of course, a lot of people have been talking about the 60s, even during the 60s, as the 60s.
You know, I've always been fascinated by books that are focused on one year. Sometimes you wonder, you know, we historians, we love to talk about change across time. That's pretty much what we like to do, and we like to talk about large swaths of time quite often, and sometimes at least decades. As you're right, we have this decade thing we do, but we rarely do a year. And so there's a way in which it's a kind of a close-up on the world, on American society at a given moment, 1965. And is there a way that you can give us a sense of how this unfolds? In other words, how do we get to 1965, and so that we can better understand the terms of the conversation about how much change took place in 65?
First, by the way, it's interesting how many books there are on individual years of the 60s, and I mentioned some of these in my preface because I know a lot of people are going to say, well, look, someone else says it's 1968.
Right.
And 1968 was a huge year. You had the Tet Offensive, you had Johnson resigning, deciding not to go for another term.
Right.
Later on, you had Nixon's election, you had the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, you had the Democratic Party's wild convention in Chicago.
Right.
So there are a lot of books on 68, a lot on 69 with Woodstock and Altamont and that sort of thing. So I'm afraid my book's by no means unique. And there's also a very good book on 1964,
right.
which makes pretty much the same argument as I do, only he sets it a year earlier. I don't have any huge quarrel with that, and I wouldn't say, look, I'm the only person that's right about this. But 65 did seem to be the time, not it was the most dramatic, 68 probably was, in terms of world-shattering, memorable events. But it was a time when the 50s and the early 60s rapidly vanished or began to vanish from view in a hurry. And the real reasons, well, you'll probably ask me that, but that's why.
Okay, I mean, I think I pretty much agree with you that the central year for the 60s is 1965, but there's something more at stake in your book. At least I think so, and I want to probe on that. We're in a way where we could either be talking about the 60s and just talking about where 65 fits into the 1960s. But there's a claim in your book is about how 1965 transformed America. And so there, in that statement, it seems to be that you're saying that America is not the same after 1965. And that's what makes 1965 unique. So there's something at stake that's beyond the 1960s. It's meaning 65 is meaningful for the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And there's a way in which one could argue with the other years there's not. But you see 65 as being the watershed year for, if I got you, for broader developments in American society. Is that correct?
Yes, pretty much. I don't want to take it too far because nobody would argue that something starts on January 1st and then it's all done in December 31st. There are a number of things about the later 60s, for instance, where you cannot see a whole lot of things happening in 1965. For instance, the women's movement.
Right.
You do have the beginnings of it in a serious way in 1965. And Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, of course, was published in 1963. But you don't have women organizing in NOW and various other groups until a little bit later. And the same thing is true with television shows and, for the most part, movies. It's not until 1967 that you get The Graduate or Bonnie and Clyde. And it's really not until the early 70s when you have the All in the Family show. And so television is much more in line with the 50s. Shows like Bonanza and Gilligan's Island and so forth are still some of the leading shows in 1965, and that doesn't change. You do see significant changes in popular music, and you'll probably want to ask me about that. But the two big changes are in civil rights and the civil rights movement and Vietnam. And those do have very lasting effects.
But because what you seem to be suggesting is that the engine of change, the engines of change, if you will, are the civil rights movement and the changes taking place within the movement and the war itself, so that you understand the cultural transformation, a much broader cultural transformation. You understand the Black Power movement and more so than just the movement, but the cultural transformation that takes place in the Black community. You understand the cultural transformation within the white community, and you understand, and ultimately, the cultural wars, if you will, coming out of the ferment of the 60s, which really began in 1965. And so that seems to be what's at stake at one level. But it also seems to be what's at stake at another level is all of the political strife that we've had beyond just the narrow cultural wars, that Reaganism must be understood by reference to 1965 and the Great Society. So the big players in the game, if you will, are indeed the civil rights movement